Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to wish La Laguna and the master's course in conference interpreting a very happy birthday. You're a bit younger than we are. Let me say that AIIC obviously has always been involved in the training and further training of interpreters. Our members, like Lourdes, teach in most of the major courses on conference interpreting throughout the world. And they bring practical experience to these courses, because I think we all realize that academic teaching is not enough. You need also to know how the interpreter actually works in a booth. And if I might say so, one of the problems, right back to the beginning. One of the problems, I think, in universities, generally speaking, is that very much courses are academically based, not always with a lot of experience. We've just heard about the problems of getting actual experience of the booth, but also actually knowing what it is to be an interpreter. I mean, most of interpreters don't actually work for the big organizations. Many are freelancers, they work for private business, and you also have to know how to go and address a client, how to go and find your first day's work on the market. And things like this are not usually taught by universities, so somebody else has to teach that. And to a large extent, that's what we try to do as an association of interpreters, is to teach some of the more practical things about being an interpreter. But of course, we also look to try to lend a hand with practical training in the institutes such as this one. And as the number of institutes throughout the world teaching conference interpreters has grown exponentially in the last years, we established a system for assessing interpreting schools, and we have now published an online directory. It's not easy for you to see it here, but probably if you've been into the AIIC site, you'll have seen the directory, and you also know that La Laguna is a part of this directory. And a lot of students actually, or before you become a student of an interpreting school, you'll go to see where you can go and study interpreting. And so some of the schools are listed in our directory. Of course, as the interpreting schools became more and more numerous, this meant more and more trainers involved. And as Dick was saying this morning, there was a need to train the trainers. We started looking at training of trainers in the 90s, but it was in 2003 in Porto, in Lisbon, in Portugal, that we held our first two-day seminar on training of trainers. That was a course which was taught by Barbara Moser-Mercer, who you heard about also this morning, and it was called Teaching Strategies for Simultaneous Interpretation. And it was a great success. And from then on, we have done many, many more courses throughout the different corners of the world. We also set up a sponsorship scheme so that some qualified trainers can also attend these courses, whether or not they are members of AIIC. In 2013, we had training of trainers courses in Rome, Barcelona, Beijing, Buenos Aires, Maputo, and Lima. And altogether, there were almost 150 participants who attended those courses in just 1 year. That means that over 300 participants have attended since the first courses started in 2003. In January this year, 2014, we again held a very popular course which takes place every year in Rome. And this year there were two groups of 15 participants at that training of trainers course. And we will be holding more of these courses throughout 2014. For example, there'll be one in Paris, then in Eastern Europe, in Accra, and in Seoul. We have been very fortunate to be able to entice people like Dick along to come and help us to train on these courses. Now, since all interpreters need to update their skills all through their careers, we also try to do professional development courses, and towards the end of last year, most particularly, they were centered especially in South America, in Lima, in Santiago, and in Brazil, obviously, with an eye to the future sporting events in Brazil. And this year they will continue in Sao Paulo, in Rio, in Cape Town, in Quito. We do try to get around the world. Some of the language refresher courses also that are organized, especially by our members in their different regions, they've become very popular. They've become kind of institutions in some places, and it's very difficult to get a place on them. This is true in Italy, it's true in France and in England, and I think that these courses are also now being followed, for example, here in Spain. And then there are all sorts of smaller, but also very important seminars which we organize, for example, on voice training. I think my own voice at the moment is a bit, doesn't like the cold here so much, but anyway. Voice training, and then for the private market, negotiating with your clients, how to sell yourself as an interpreter, to ply your trade as an interpreter on the private market. I know there was one recently even in London on time tracking for interpreters. How much time does an interpreter spend preparing for a conference? How much time do you spend traveling to go to a conference? How much time do you spend negotiating with your clients? Things like that. It's very interesting to know all of those elements of time which eventually should become a part of the invoice that you give your client at the end of the day for having worked for them. Our colleagues also, we have a special committee that deals with private market interpreting, and they often organize very interesting courses on the fringe of their own meetings. And there was one in Athens this January looking at how to reply to tenders. If you're an interpreter on the private market, some of our interpreters also become consultant interpreters, and then they have to know how to reply to tenders. And some of the tenders, as Mr. Benedetti will know, if they are put out by the European Commission or by big businesses, or they're very, very complicated, and it takes a lot of time to be able to answer them. I think anyway that you'll find the details of all these courses on our website. They're posted on our events page. And we also advertise courses which are run by other bodies, other associations, other universities, and you can find those generally on our announcements pages. Today, however, I was asked to speak most particularly about training in the field of interpreting in conflict areas. It's a pretty difficult thing to do because there is not a lot of it. In 2009, AIIC created a project to help interpreters in conflict areas, most particularly because we were hearing about the hundreds of dead and injured interpreters in war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. The project was originally intended to cover a broad spectrum of conflict, not only in war zones. So, for example, we supported on our Facebook pages our colleagues who were in conflict with the government in the United Kingdom, following total upheaval in court interpreting services in the UK. But it's true that most particularly we have been looking at the plight of interpreters who are recruited by governments to assist their armies in conflict or in post-conflict situations. Now, here our project differs from another one, which is run by Barbara Moser-Mercer from the University of Geneva. She has a project which is called the InZone, which actually trains interpreters, usually in a virtual environment, interpreters who go to work for humanitarian organizations, most particularly the Red Cross, the UNHCR, things like this. But she obviously then concentrates on training. We are not specifically concerned with training. We were much more concerned with awareness raising about the immediate plight of the interpreters in these very high-risk settings and the dangers that they face, the need to protect them both during and post-conflict, on and off the battlefield. Most of these interpreters are either locally or recruited, or they're recruited in the home countries of the armies to work for the armed forces as civilian interpreters, and they are not trained interpreters. They come from all walks of life. Very often they're language teachers or have worked in industry, but they happen to know another language. And they're recruited usually by agencies according to their criteria of linguistic proficiency, physical or psychological suitability. And these criteria are often totally inadequate. Training here is usually either non-existent or extremely brief, and it's generally a process of learning through doing. Thousands of these civilian interpreters were recruited during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And generally speaking, there were too many of them to be able to give them proper training. Apart from the difficulty of teaching even basic interpreting skills to so many people, we believe that a main problem lies in trying to equate the ethics of our profession, which requires interpreters to be impartial in their work, to the requirements of absolute allegiance to the cause of an armed force. In that environment, interpreters are perceived not as impartial intermediaries, but as supporters of the foreign cause. And that, of course, creates enormous problems when the troops leave the country. And as we see now, especially in Afghanistan, interpreters and their families are being targeted and killed as traitors. Together with our partner organizations, most particularly the Red T, which is in New York, with FIT, the International Federation of Translators, and YAPT, the International Association of Professional Translators and Interpreters, we have been trying to convince the public, heads of state and government, at least in our own countries and in Spain, to help their interpreters and not leave them behind. We believe that although we may be a very small link in the chain, our voice has been heard in some countries. Governments have started to bring at least a few interpreters back and not leave them in Iraq or Afghanistan to be killed. We also initiated an open letter campaign, and we wrote to the Spanish Minister of Defense when Spain abandoned her interpreters in Afghanistan. It is, of course, very difficult to change perceptions. You can find all of these letters and a lot of material on our website. It's very difficult, of course, to change perceptions, the traduttore traditore thing. But we do consider that interpreters would be better protected by some kind of internationally recognized status. And we took a first step towards that when we obtained the signatures of 40 members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on a written declaration concerning the protection of interpreters both during and after conflict. We're still working to take that action forward elsewhere, perhaps in the UN. As well as training interpreters, therefore, what we're trying to do, very ambitiously perhaps, is to train the world. In the meantime, however, we do have also some smaller ambitions, and we believe that interpreters and the people who employ them should be aware of their rights and their duties, of the basic principles of interpreting and of interpreting ethics. They should be aware of how best to work together and how best the interpreters can be protected both on and off the battlefield. So with our partners, we produced a first field guide, which we've translated into a number of languages. It's available on our site and on the sites of our partners. And we're very happy to know that that guide, perhaps because we participated in another project called Languages at War in London, our guide now has become also a reference for the British Ministry of Defence, and it's quoted in one of their more recent publications concerning linguistic support for operations. So, for those interpreters who survive the reprisals after troop withdrawals, it is possible, of course, that some of them may continue to work as interpreters, perhaps for the humanitarian organizations for which Barbara Moser has now created a training platform. And then, obviously, they would be able to get some training. But at the moment, I'm afraid, it's a question of their survival. And in order to survive, those interpreters need our help and your help. Thank you very much.